The flight was calm until a little black girl slowly stood up from her seat, her legs barely steady beneath her. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, mixing with the soft chatter of passengers who were settling in for what they believed would be an ordinary journey. She clutched the back of the seat in front of her as she stepped into the aisle, her small fingers trembling so badly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were wide with fear, scanning the faces around her as if searching for someone, anyone, who would understand what she was trying to say before it was too late. "My mom needs help," she whispered at first, her voice almost lost beneath the sound of the plane. When no one responded, she spoke louder, panic creeping into every word. She said her mother was very sick, that she was having trouble breathing, that something was terribly wrong. A few passengers turned their heads, curiosity flickering across their faces before shifting into mild concern. Some leaned forward slightly, trying to see past the seats, while others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether this was a serious situation or just a misunderstanding. The girl took another step down the aisle, her sneakers scuffing softly against the carpet. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to keep going. She repeated herself again, explaining that her mother had been unwell even before the flight, that she had begged her to stay awake, that now she was barely responding. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words tumbling over one another in desperate urgency. She did not sound like a child seeking attention. She sounded like a child who was terrified of losing the one person she loved most. A middle-aged man seated near the aisle suddenly let out an irritated sigh. He rolled his eyes and clicked his tongue loudly, making sure everyone could hear his annoyance. He complained that the girl was being disruptive and accused her of making up stories to cause trouble. His tone was sharp, dismissive, and cruel. He told her to sit down and stop bothering people, insisting that flight attendants would handle things if there was a real problem. The word real hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The girl froze where she stood. For a brief moment, doubt crossed her face, as if she wondered whether she had done something wrong. But then she shook her head slightly, as though pushing away the fear that threatened to silence her. She looked directly at the man, her eyes glossy with unshed tears, and repeated that her mother could not breathe properly. Her voice was louder now, trembling not just with fear, but with a growing sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman across the aisle pressed her lips together, clearly disturbed by the exchange. A man a few rows back leaned out, trying to see what was happening, while another passenger muttered under his breath that someone should call a flight attendant. Still, no one stood up. The racist passenger continued to complain, raising his voice and accusing the girl of exaggerating, suggesting that children often misunderstand things and cause unnecessary panic. The cabin, once peaceful, grew thick with tension. The air felt heavier, as though everyone was holding their breath. The little girl's hands shook even more now, her fingers curling into her sleeves as she fought the urge to cry. She glanced back toward her seat, where her mother lay slumped against the window, her chest rising and falling unevenly. Each breath looked like a struggle, and the sight filled the girl with a fresh wave of fear. She spoke again, this time almost pleading, asking someone to please help her. Her words were uneven, broken by sobs she could no longer hold back. She explained that her mother's lips were turning pale, that she was not answering when spoken to. Her fear was raw and unmistakable, cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the plane like a knife. Even those who had tried to ignore the situation could no longer pretend they had not heard her. The racist passenger scoffed and shook his head, muttering that the flight should not be delayed because of drama. He insisted that medical emergencies would be obvious and accused the girl of trying to gain sympathy. His words stung, not just because of their cruelty, but because they carried an ugly assumption that her pain was not worth taking seriously. The way he looked at her, with suspicion instead of concern, made the injustice of the moment painfully clear. The girl's shoulders slumped for a second, exhaustion and fear weighing her down. But then something changed. Her face tightened with determination, and she wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. She straightened her posture, even though her knees were still shaking, and spoke once more. This time, her voice was louder than it had ever been, echoing down the aisle. She said she would not sit down because her mother was dying, and she refused to be quiet while the person she loved most in the world suffered just a few seats away. A hush fell over the cabin. Conversations stopped. Even the engines seemed quieter in that moment. Passengers stared, some with widened eyes, others with expressions of guilt. The girl's courage, born not from confidence but from necessity, forced everyone to confront the reality they had been avoiding. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a child fighting against time, fear, and prejudice all at once. The racist passenger opened his mouth to speak again, but his words faltered. The strength in the girl's voice, the pain etched across her face, made it harder to dismiss her as a nuisance. A flight attendant, alerted by the raised voices, finally appeared at the end of the aisle. Her professional smile faded the moment she took in the scene, the crying child, the tense passengers, and the woman slumped motionless in her seat. The little girl turned toward the attendant as if she were a lifeline. She repeated her plea, her voice shaking but steady enough to be understood. She said her mother needed help now. Not later. Not after takeoff. Now. The attendant knelt slightly to meet the girl's eye level, and in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to realize the gravity of what was happening. The calm of the flight had been shattered, not by chaos, but by a child's refusal to be silenced. Her fear, her love, and her courage filled the cabin, leaving no room for ignorance or dismissal. What began as a quiet journey had transformed into a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest truth, and that ignoring it can cost far more than anyone is willing to admit. The girl refused to sit down. Even as tears streamed down her cheeks and her chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths, she stood her ground in the middle of the aisle. Her voice shook, but her words were clear enough to cut through the tension that had settled over the cabin. She said her mother was dying. She said she needed medical help immediately. Not later, not after takeoff, not when it was convenient for everyone else. Now. Every second mattered, and she could feel time slipping away with every shallow breath her mother struggled to take. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to clench them into fists to keep them from shaking apart. She wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing tears across her skin, and looked from one passenger to another, searching for understanding. She explained that her mother had been sick for a long time, that the doctors had warned them about her condition, and that today she had seemed weaker than ever. She said her mother had told her to stay calm, but now she wasn't responding the way she should. The fear in the girl's voice was raw and uncontrollable, the kind that comes from knowing something terrible is happening and feeling powerless to stop it. The racist passenger let out a harsh laugh that felt completely out of place. He mocked the girl openly, shaking his head and speaking loudly enough for others to hear. He accused her of exaggerating and said she was just trying to get attention. He complained that she was holding up the aisle and making people uncomfortable. His words were sharp and dismissive, dripping with cruelty, as if the fear of a child meant nothing compared to his irritation. He leaned slightly into the aisle, deliberately blocking her path, using his body to assert control over the situation. The girl stared at him, stunned. For a moment, she seemed too shocked to speak. Her lower lip trembled, and fresh tears spilled over, sliding down her face unchecked. She tried to step around him, but he shifted again, preventing her from moving forward. The simple act of being physically blocked felt like another blow, another reminder that she was small, young, and being treated as if her pain was an inconvenience rather than an emergency. She raised her voice, begging him to move, telling him she needed to get help. Her words came out fast and uneven, tangled with sobs she could no longer hold back. She said her mother couldn't breathe properly, that her eyes wouldn't open, that she was scared she would lose her right there on the plane. The cabin filled with the sound of her crying, a sound so desperate that it made some passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. A few people looked away, unable or unwilling to meet the child's gaze. Others stared openly, their expressions caught somewhere between concern and uncertainty. No one seemed to know what to do, and the delay only made the girl more frantic. The racist passenger continued to complain, claiming she was causing trouble and suggesting she should be disciplined for not following instructions. He spoke as though he had authority, as though his comfort mattered more than a medical emergency. The girl's chest tightened, and for a brief second, it felt like the world was closing in on her. Her ears rang, and her vision blurred with tears. She thought of her mother's hand in hers earlier, weak but warm, squeezing gently as if to say everything would be okay. She thought of the way her mother had smiled at her, even though she looked exhausted, and told her how brave she was. That memory sparked something inside her, a small but powerful flame of determination that refused to go out. She reached up to the overhead panel and pressed the call button. Once, twice, again and again, the sound of the alert chimed through the cabin, sharp and impossible to ignore. She pressed it repeatedly, her small finger slamming against the button with urgency, as if each press might summon help faster. Her cries grew louder, echoing down the aisle and bouncing off the walls of the plane. She called out for help, her voice cracking as she begged someone to listen to her. The repeated chime drew more attention than her words alone ever could. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The racist passenger scowled, clearly irritated, and told her to stop it, accusing her of causing a scene. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Fear had stripped away any sense of embarrassment or hesitation. All that mattered was her mother, slumped in her seat, fighting for breath. Her cries filled the plane, cutting through the artificial calm that airlines try so hard to maintain. The sound of a child in distress has a way of reaching people in places they try to keep guarded, and slowly, the mood in the cabin began to shift. A woman a few rows away covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his face pale, realizing this was not a performance or an overreaction. The girl pressed the call button again, her arms shaking from the effort. She called out that her mother was dying, that she needed a doctor, that she needed someone now. Her voice echoed, raw and desperate, refusing to be silenced. The racist passenger tried to speak over her, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the alert and the intensity of her cries. Time seemed to stretch painfully. Each second felt longer than the last, and the girl's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She glanced back toward her mother again, her fear spiking when she saw how still she looked. Panic surged through her, and she cried even harder, calling her mother's name as if that alone could keep her alive. Finally, movement stirred at the front of the cabin. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her expression shifting from professional calm to alarm as she took in the scene. She saw the child standing there, crying and pressing the call button, the angry passenger blocking the aisle, and the unresponsive woman slumped in her seat. The reality of the situation hit her all at once. The girl turned toward the attendant, hope flashing through her tears like a lifeline. She spoke again, her voice hoarse but urgent, explaining that her mother was dying and needed help immediately. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth as she understood it, driven by love and fear in equal measure. The cabin was silent now. Even the racist passenger had stopped talking, his complaints swallowed by the weight of the moment. Every eye was on the girl and the flight attendant, and for the first time since she had stood up, the child felt like people were truly listening. Her cries had forced the entire plane to pay attention, turning her fear into a sound that could no longer be ignored. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The girl was no longer just a frightened child being dismissed and mocked. She was a daughter fighting for her mother's life, and her refusal to sit down, to stay quiet, to be invisible, had changed everything. The flight attendants rushed in from different directions, their expressions shifting instantly from routine professionalism to focused urgency. One knelt beside the little girl, speaking softly to calm her, while another moved quickly toward the woman slumped in the window seat. The captain was alerted within seconds, his voice coming through the intercom as he requested details about the situation. What had moments ago been a tense but uncertain disturbance now transformed into a clear medical emergency, and the entire rhythm of the plane changed. When the attendants reached the girl's mother, they immediately saw what the child had been trying so desperately to explain. The woman's breathing was shallow and irregular, her skin pale and damp with sweat. Her eyes were half open but unfocused, and when an attendant gently called her name, there was no response. One attendant checked her pulse, her face tightening as she counted silently. Another retrieved the emergency medical kit, moving with speed and precision born from training and experience. The little girl stood close, clutching the armrest, her whole body trembling as she watched. Her tears hadn't stopped, but now they were mixed with fragile hope. She answered every question the attendants asked, telling them about her mother's illness, the medications she was supposed to take, and how she had grown weaker during the flight. Her voice was hoarse from crying, yet she pushed through the pain, determined not to leave out a single detail that might help save her mother's life. The captain announced that the plane would be diverting for an emergency landing. His voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. He explained that a passenger required immediate medical attention and that the safety of human life came before schedules, connections, or inconvenience. The words echoed through the cabin, and with them came a collective realization that this child's persistence had altered the course of the entire flight. Passengers sat in stunned silence. Some bowed their heads, others watched with wide eyes as the attendants worked. The racist passenger who had mocked and blocked the girl earlier remained frozen in his seat, his earlier confidence evaporated. He avoided eye contact, his face flushed with embarrassment and something darker, perhaps guilt. No one listened to him now. No one cared about his complaints. His voice, once loud and dismissive, had been completely silenced by the truth unfolding before everyone. An announcement came asking if there were any medical professionals on board. A doctor and a nurse stood up almost immediately, pushing past seats to reach the woman. They took over seamlessly, checking vitals, administering oxygen, and giving instructions to the attendants. The girl watched every movement, holding her breath as if afraid that even the smallest sound might disrupt the fragile balance keeping her mother alive. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was thick but focused. No one complained. No one argued. Seat belts were fastened quietly, instructions followed without resistance. The entire aircraft felt united by a single purpose, one that had been ignited by the courage of a child who refused to be ignored. The engines changed pitch as the plane turned, each second bringing them closer to help. The girl finally felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. One of the attendants smiled at her reassuringly, telling her she had done the right thing, that she was incredibly brave. The words hit her all at once, and she broke down, sobbing into the attendant's arm. The fear she had been holding inside spilled out, now mixed with relief that adults were finally taking control. Even through her tears, she never took her eyes off her mother. When the plane touched down, emergency responders were already waiting on the runway. The doors opened swiftly, and paramedics boarded with a stretcher and equipment. They moved with practiced urgency, carefully lifting the girl's mother and continuing treatment as they prepared to transport her to the hospital. The girl was allowed to walk alongside them, holding her mother's hand, whispering her name again and again as if to anchor her to the world. Passengers watched quietly as mother and daughter were escorted off the plane. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others sat with their hands clasped, shaken by how close they had come to witnessing a tragedy. A few people stood and applauded softly, not for drama, but for the courage of a child whose voice had changed everything. The sound was gentle but sincere, filling the cabin with a sense of shared humanity. The racist passenger remained seated, staring straight ahead. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, his earlier cruelty now exposed in the harshest possible light. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no punishment delivered in words. The silence itself was enough. In the face of a child's bravery and a life hanging in the balance, his behavior had been rendered small and shameful. As the plane prepared to continue its journey, the captain spoke again over the intercom. He acknowledged the delay and thanked everyone for their cooperation, but he also made a point to recognize the little girl. He said that her actions had saved a life, that her refusal to stay silent had given the crew the chance to act in time. His words carried weight, and they lingered long after the announcement ended. The flight resumed, but it was no longer the same. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Strangers exchanged glances of understanding, bound by what they had witnessed together. The story of the brave little girl spread softly from row to row, retold with admiration and awe. She had not been loud or powerful in the way adults often define strength, but she had been unwavering when it mattered most. Somewhere in an emergency room, doctors continued to work on the girl's mother, guided by the precious minutes her daughter had fought to secure. That knowledge settled into the hearts of the passengers like a heavy truth. They understood now how close they had come to losing someone, and how easily it could have happened if a frightened child had chosen obedience over courage. In that moment, everyone saw what true bravery looked like. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. It was a little girl standing alone in an aisle, crying and pressing a call button again and again, refusing to let prejudice, impatience, or indifference drown out her voice. She had saved her mother not with strength or authority, but with love, persistence, and an unbreakable will to be heard. Long after the plane reached its destination, the memory stayed with those who witnessed it. It became a quiet lesson carried forward into their lives, a reminder that courage can come in the smallest forms, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stand up when no one else will.